The wind was sharp against Clara Whitmore's cheeks as the wagon train creaked its way up the muddy trail, the wheels groaning under the weight of too many hopes and not enough provisions. Grey skies pressed low over the mountains, the scent of rain on the air, as if nature itself was warning them to turn back. But there was no turning back for Clara. Not now. Clara tightened her shawl over her shoulders, her hands resting instinctively on her swollen belly. 6 months along, she was painfully aware of every jolt and bump, each dip in the uneven trail. Inside her, the baby shifted, a reminder of the little life that had kept her going since David's death. She closed her eyes briefly, willing herself to stay calm. Just a few more weeks, she thought. A new start in Oregon. A place where no one whispered behind her back, where no one pitied the widowed young woman traveling west alone. "Clara, ride in the back today," Malcolm Whitmore called over his shoulder, his voice slick with forced concern. He was David's brother, her brother-in-law in name only, and Clara had long learned that his kindness came at a price. "You're pale as a sheet," Malcolm added, glancing at her with a tight-lipped smile. "Best you get some rest." His wife, Eleanor, sat stiffly beside him on the bench, her expression unreadable. Their 3 children were huddled under the wagon canvas, eyes wide and silent as usual. Clara swallowed hard and climbed into the back of their wagon without a word. She wasn't about to provoke Malcolm's temper. The trail narrowed as they moved into the mountain pass. The oxen strained, hooves slipping on wet rocks, as the rain began to fall in earnest, a cold and relentless drizzle. Clara's fingers curled around the wooden slats of the wagon as it rocked violently. She could hear Malcolm shouting at the animals, Eleanor's sharp voice cutting through the din, trying to calm the children. She shivered. The chill was getting into her bones. A jolt rattled through the wagon. And then came the moment Clara would replay in her mind for weeks to come. "We need to lighten the load," Malcolm barked. His voice was panicked now, not the careful, honeyed tone he used when talking to her in camp. "Too much weight. We can't risk tipping on this pass." "Maybe we should wait out the storm," Clara called hesitantly from the back. Malcolm's laughter was cold. "And freeze up here? We move on, Clara. Don't you worry your pretty head." Then, with terrifying suddenness, Clara felt a rough shove at her back. She barely had time to gasp before the world lurched sideways. The sky spun above her, the wagon's canvas whipping past in a blur. Her fingers scrabbled at empty air, heart hammering, and then her body struck the rocky ground below. The impact stole her breath. Pain flared through her leg, white-hot and sharp, and something wet trickled down the side of her face. She tried to move, to call out, but the pain locked her in place. Somewhere above, the wagon wheels clattered on, the sound growing fainter, swallowed by the storm. "Malcolm," Clara's voice cracked, weak against the pounding rain. "Eleanor, please." No one came. With every breath, Clara felt the cold sinking deeper into her bones. She turned her head slightly, one hand cradling her belly. The baby kicked weakly inside her, a fluttering pulse of life against the vast, indifferent wilderness. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered through chattering teeth. "I'm so sorry." The sky above blurred, grey folding into black. Far above the ravine, Hawkeye's moved silently through the trees, his moccasins barely leaving a mark in the damp earth. The deer he had been tracking had long since vanished, its trail washed away by the storm. Yet something made him pause. A flicker of movement, or perhaps a sound carried on the wind. His eyes narrowed. He moved toward the ridge, crouching low. There, crumpled among the rocks below, was a figure, pale as a winter moon, motionless, except for the faint rise and fall of her chest. A white woman, and heavy with child. Hawkeye's felt his pulse quicken, his instincts at war. He knew the risk of crossing into the settler's world. His people, the Shawnee, were already too familiar with broken promises and sudden violence. But to leave her here was to condemn 2 lives, not one. And among his people, no life was more sacred than that of a mother and child. "Great Spirit," Hawkeyes murmured, his dark eyes scanning the forest. Guide my heart. He moved swiftly down the slope, his lean form cutting through the undergrowth. Like a shadow, kneeling beside the woman, he studied her face, pale with pain and fear, the blood at her temple, the twisted angle of her leg. It would take more than his simple remedies to heal this. And the baby, he could see the contractions beginning, the tight clenching of her belly even through the sodden fabric. Her eyelids fluttered open. For a heartbeat, panic flashed in her gaze. Her fingers clawed weakly toward him, a cry rasping from her throat. Peace, Hawkeye said softly, raising his hands in a gesture of calm. His English was halting, learned through traders and missionaries, but his tone was unmistakable. No harm. Clara's eyes searched his face, wide and terrified, but something, the softness of his voice, the open hands, made her hesitate. My baby, she whispered, tears mingling with rain on her cheeks. Hawkeye's nodded once, solemnly. I help. The decision settled in his bones. He worked quickly, gathering saplings and rawhide from his pack to lash together a travois, a simple sled, to drag behind him. His fingers were swift and sure, the skills of a hunter turned to a healer's purpose. As he slid Clara onto the frame, her breath hitched in pain, a broken sob escaping her lips. Hawkeye's murmured soft reassurances in his native tongue, though he knew she couldn't understand the words. When all was ready, he straightened, testing the weight of the travois harnessed across his shoulders. 4 hours to his village, perhaps less if the storm eased. 4 hours to save 2 lives balanced on the edge of loss. Clara's voice was a whisper against the wind. Clara, she said, her fingers brushing her chest. My name, Clara. Hawkeye's touched his own chest in turn. Hawkeye's, and then they were moving. The storm at their backs, the forest rising up to claim them. The storm had calmed to a drizzle, but the cold cut deeper as the night crept over the hills. Hawkeye's tightened the leather straps across his shoulders, feeling the drag of the travois behind him. Where Clara lay shivering under a rough wool blanket, every step through the forest floor was calculated, avoiding sharp stones, low branches, and patches of mud that might slow them. His breath came in slow, even pulls, the weight a challenge but not impossible. He had carried deer heavier than this, but never had he carried a life as delicate, as breakable, as the one now resting behind him. He glanced back at her. Clara's face was pale, her lips tinged blue, her eyelids fluttering as if caught between sleep and waking. Her hands cradled her belly, fingers clenched tight, every now and then jerking as pain rippled through her body. Almost, Hawkeye's murmured, though he doubted she heard him. His English was spare, and his words more habit than comfort. The trail narrowed, climbing along a steep rise where tree roots twisted from the ground like gnarled hands. Hawkeye's paused at the base of the slope, calculating. The village lay just beyond the ridge, hidden in a hollow where the trees grew thick, and the settlers' wagons dared not follow. He shifted the traverse straps, took a deep breath, and began the climb. Behind him, Clara stirred. David, she whispered, her voice cracked and broken. No, please. Hawkeye's heard the tremble in her voice, the desperate clinging to a name he did not know, and felt something shift inside him. This woman, this stranger, she carried grief like a stone in her chest. He wondered, briefly, about the man she called for, what loss had driven her west, what future she had imagined before fate scattered it like autumn leaves. They reached the crest. The moon broke through the clouds, silvering the trees and casting the village below into faint light. Smoke curled from 1 or 2 lodge fires. The rest had been extinguished to avoid the attention of passing scouts. Hawkeye's let out a low whistle, sharp and brief. A figure emerged from the shadows. Willow's spirit, the medicine woman, wrapped in a deerskin robe, her silver hair braided with tiny beads. She moved with quiet urgency, eyes sharp as they swept from Hawkeye's to the bundle on the travois. Who is this? She asked softly, slipping easily into Shawnee. A woman, Hawkeye's replied. With child. Alone. Willow. Spirit's expression tightened. Why bring her here? She would have died. His voice was steady, but there was a plea hidden in it, one only the old woman would hear. With a small nod, Willow's spirit reached for the blanket, lifting the edge to study Clara's face. She pressed 2 fingers to Clara's throat, felt the faint, uneven pulse, her brows furrowed. "The baby comes soon," Clara moaned, twisting weakly. Willow's spirit gestured toward the largest lodge. "Take her there, quickly." Word spread as they moved through the village. Faces appeared at lodge entrances. Bright River, her arms full of firewood, Grey Wolf, sharpening arrowheads, Stone Hand, stirring a pot over the fire. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed and silent. Some villagers murmured in concern, others in anger. "A white woman? Why risk our safety? Will the soldiers come looking?" But no one stopped them. Inside the lodge, the air was warm and thick with the scent of herbs. Hawkeyes laid Clara gently on a pile of furs as Willow's spirit set to work, heating water, crushing roots, whispering words in a soothing cadence that filled the room like a song. Clara's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, confusion rippled through her features. The strange roof above, the dark figures moving at the edge of her vision, the foreign tongue. Then her gaze settled on Hawkeyes, kneeling nearby. "Where?" she rasped. "Safe," Hawkeyes said softly, placing a hand over his heart. She drew in a shaky breath, her hands searching instinctively for her belly. "The baby, please. Not yet. Not yet." Willow's spirit leaned over her, voice gentle but firm. "It is time," she said slowly in English, her accent careful but clear. "You must be strong." Clara choked back a sob. "No, I can't. I can't do this." But Willow's spirit only smiled faintly. "All mothers say this, and all mothers are wrong." The night stretched long around them, the cries of labor and the low chant of prayers mingling under the roof. Hawkeyes waited outside, sitting cross-legged near the fire, his eyes fixed on the stars that winked between drifting clouds. His fingers worried a small carved pendant around his neck, a hawk in flight, a gift from his father, a symbol of strength and vision. Inside, the sounds shifted from the sharp edge of pain to the thin, piercing wail of a newborn. When Willow's spirit emerged, her lined face softened in the firelight. She carried a small bundle wrapped in rabbit fur. She held it out to Hawkeyes without a word. For a moment, Hawkeyes hesitated. Then, with surprising tenderness, he reached out, brushing a finger along the infant's downy cheek. The child squirmed, let out a tiny protesting sound, then quieted. "A girl," Willow's spirit murmured. "The strong lungs, like her mother." Hawkeyes exhaled slowly, a tension he had not realized he held slipping from his shoulders. Inside, Clara drifted between exhaustion and a dazed peace. Her gaze found Hawkeyes as he stepped into the lodge, the tiny bundle cradled against his chest. A faint, wobbly smile tugged at her mouth. "Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Her name is Grace." Hawkeyes repeated the name softly, tasting its unfamiliar shape. Grace. And for the first time in many months, Clara Whitmore let her eyes close without fear. Morning broke over the village in pale streaks of light that barely warmed the ground. Hawkeyes stood just beyond the lodge, arms crossed over his chest, watching the last wisps of night fade. His eyes, sharp and thoughtful, flicked back to the doorway where Willow's spirit emerged, gently pulling the hide curtain aside. "She is stronger today," the medicine woman said softly, a faint smile tugging at her weathered face. "The child, too." Hawkeyes nodded. "Good." Inside the lodge, Clara stirred. The ache in her body was deep, woven into her bones like a memory she could not shake. She blinked up at the dim rafters, her hand drifting to the small bundle at her side. Baby Grace was sleeping, cheeks flushed, tiny mouth moving in a dream. Clara felt her chest tighten, a mixture of love and fear so fierce it stole her breath. The door flap rustled. Bright River entered, arms full of folded buckskin and a bowl of steaming broth. Her long dark braids swung over her shoulder as she knelt beside Clara, eyes kind but curious. "Eat," Bright River said softly, gesturing to the bowl. Clara tried to sit up, wincing as the effort pulled at the bruises on her side and the deep ache in her leg. Bright River gently helped, sliding a folded skin behind her back. Clara accepted the bowl with shaking hands, managing a faint thank you, though she doubted Bright River understood the words. She ate slowly, savoring each mouthful, grateful for the warmth that spread through her chest. As she ate, she glanced around the lodge, eyes lingering on the patterns painted on the walls, stylized hawks, deer, rivers, trees. It was a world entirely foreign to her, yet, for the first time in weeks, she felt safe. Outside, Hawkeyes and Grey Wolf knelt over a map drawn in the dirt, their fingers tracing the safest paths west. "The baby can't travel soon," Grey Wolf murmured. His voice was steady, but there was a flicker of concern in his dark eyes. "But the longer she stays, the greater the risk." Hawkeyes ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "I know." They had seen smoke on the northern ridge, scouts perhaps, or settlers, searching for the woman. And Clara's people would not leave her behind forever. Hawkeyes felt the old weight pressing on his shoulders, the impossible balance between his people and hers. Inside, Clara rocked Grace slowly, humming under her breath. It was a song her mother had sung to her once, when life had felt simpler. The baby stirred, tiny fists waving, a yawn creasing her small face. The door flap opened, and Hawkeyes entered, his gaze softening at the sight of mother and child. Clara looked up, offering a tentative smile. "She's better today," he nodded, crouching near the fire. "You strong," he said, gesturing to her heart. Clara's throat tightened. "Not strong, just lucky." He tilted his head, considering, then touched his chest. "Hawkeyes." She touched hers lightly. "Clara." He nodded with quiet satisfaction. Then, gently, he reached out, his fingers brushing the baby's tiny hand. Grace's fingers closed instinctively around one of his, and something softened in his expression. A flicker of wonder, of connection that needed no words. That afternoon, Willow's spirit entered, her expression more serious. "Soon," she said, glancing between them. "You go." Clara's stomach turned. She had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, she felt a rush of panic. She looked down at Grace, so small, so vulnerable. Could they survive the journey? Could she survive losing this strange and unexpected sanctuary? Hawkeyes read the fear in her face. "With you?" he said firmly. Clara exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. Willow's spirit pressed a bundle of herbs into Clara's hands and murmured something in Shawnee. Then, switching to halting English, she added, "For baby, for you, keep strong." Clara swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "Thank you," she whispered. That evening, as the sun dipped below the treetops, the village gathered for a quiet farewell. Bright River pressed a carved wooden rattle into Clara's hands, her eyes shining with unspoken emotion. Grey Wolf clapped Hawkeyes on the shoulder, murmuring a blessing. Even the children peeked out from behind the lodge poles, eyes wide with curiosity and sadness. Clara felt the weight of their kindness settle on her heart, like a stone. As the last light faded, Hawkeyes led Clara outside, lifting her gently onto a makeshift litter strapped between two poles. She winced as her leg was jostled, but she bit down on the pain, whispering soothing words to Grace. As the baby whimpered softly, the forest stretched before them, dark and endless. And yet, with each careful step forward, Clara felt something stir inside her, a small, flickering ember of hope. The first light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting long fingers of pale gold over the forest floor. Hawkeyes moved like a shadow at the front of the small party, his eyes sharp and alert. Behind him, Clara lay on the litter, cradling Grace tightly to her chest. Her chestnut hair was damp with sweat, her blue-gray dress rumpled and marked with the journey's dirt. She bit her lip to keep from crying out each time the litter jostled over a rock or root. The ache in her leg was nearly unbearable, and her arms trembled with the strain of holding her child. Yet, through it all, Clara focused on Grace's steady breathing, the tiny warmth of her body, a fragile thread of life, anchoring her to the world. Hawkeye's glanced back often, his dark eyes flickering from Clara to the path ahead. Beside him, Grey Wolf and Stone Hand shouldered the poles of the litter with quiet strength, their faces set with determination. Red Feather, the youngest of the group, darted ahead, scouting the path like a restless spirit. As they wove deeper into the forest, the trees thickened, their trunks like pillars in a silent cathedral. The hush of the woods was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the sharp cry of a bird overhead. Clara's head lolled to the side, her skin pale and clammy. She felt the world narrowing to a tunnel of sound. The murmur of voices, the thud of footsteps, the soft, hiccuping cries of Grace. Somewhere inside, panic clawed at her chest. How much farther would they make it in time? A gentle hand touched her shoulder. Clara forced her eyes open to see Hawkeye's leaning close, his brow furrowed with concern. "Rest soon," he murmured, the words heavy with meaning. He gestured to a small clearing ahead, where a stream wound through the rocks. They paused there, lowering the litter carefully onto a bed of pine needles. Grey Wolf offered a pouch of water, and Hawkeye's knelt beside Clara, holding the canteen to her lips. The cool water was a shock, making her cough, but she drank gratefully. "Thank you," Clara rasped, her voice barely a whisper. Hawkeye's reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. For a moment their eyes met, two worlds colliding, finding, unexpectedly, a flicker of understanding. As they rested, Red Feather returned, his face grim. He spoke quickly in Shawnee, the words sharp and urgent. Clara didn't understand, but the ripple of tension through the group was unmistakable. "Men," Hawkeyes said, turning to her, his voice clipped. "Coming. Bad men." Clara's heart lurched. She didn't need translation. Malcolm. Fear surged through her, sending a rush of adrenaline through her battered body. She clutched Grace tighter, feeling the baby stir and whimper. Hawkeyes laid a hand on her arm, his touch firm but reassuring. "We move fast." The break was over. With practiced speed, the men lifted the litter once more, their movements smooth despite the urgency pressing in on them. Hawkeyes slipped ahead, guiding them through a narrow deer trail that wound like a serpent through the trees. The sun climbed higher, and the forest grew warmer, the scent of pine and damp earth thick in the air. Clara's thoughts twisted in and out of clarity. She imagined David's face, kind, steady, gone too soon. She imagined Oregon, the place they were supposed to start again, now only a distant, unreachable dream. But when she looked at Grace's tiny, perfect face, the despair softened. There was no turning back, only forward. By late afternoon, they reached a rise overlooking a wide valley. Far in the distance, smoke curled from chimneys, the trading post. Relief surged through Clara, so fierce it made her dizzy. But Hawkeye's face remained tense. He crouched beside Red Feather, studying the land below. Clara could see them pointing, hear their low voices, exchanging plans. "Tonight," Hawkeyes said at last, turning to Clara. "We go tonight, safe in dark." Clara nodded faintly, her body too exhausted to argue. She closed her eyes, her arms wrapped protectively around Grace, and allowed herself a moment, just one moment of fragile hope. As dusk fell, the forest changed. Shadows deepened, and the cool hush of evening settled over the trees. The group moved swiftly, their steps muffled on the soft earth. Clara felt every dip and jolt of the litter, but her grip on Grace never loosened. When they reached the edge of the forest, Hawkeyes crouched low, his form barely visible in the growing dark. Red Feather slipped ahead, vanishing into the night, and Hawkeyes knelt beside Clara, his face calm but intent. "Soon," he whispered, brushing a hand over Grace's head. We are near. Night fell like a soft blanket over the forest, muffling the sounds of their footsteps. As the small group pressed forward, the moon hung low and pale above the treetops, casting silvery ribbons across the ground. Hawkeye's moved at the front, his sharp eyes sweeping left and right, his body a fluid shadow among the trees. Behind him, Grey Wolf and Stone Hand carried the litter with practiced care, their shoulders braced under the weight. Clara lay bundled in blankets, her arms curled tightly round Grace, whose tiny breaths warmed her chest. Every so often Clara's lips moved in a whispered lullaby, a trembling thread of sound that helped keep the fear at bay. Clara no longer remembered when exhaustion had set in. It was simply part of her now, woven into the ache of her body, but she stayed awake, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill every time she thought of Malcolm, of the wagon train disappearing into the storm, of the life she had almost lost, and the unexpected hands that had caught her before she fell completely. She had watched Hawkeye's more closely over the past hours. His quiet determination, his watchful glances, his patience as she struggled to stand or drink. These things had spoken to her more clearly than words. When they paused again, Hawkeye's knelt at her side. He held a small piece of dried venison, offering it with a gentle nod. Clara accepted it with shaking hands, chewing slowly, grateful for the taste even if it made her throat ache. "Thank you," she whispered. Hawkeye's touched his chest lightly in acknowledgement, then gestured to Grace. "Strong," he murmured, smiling faintly. Clara looked down at her daughter, tears pricking her eyes. "She's all I have now." Hawkeye's tilted his head, as if tasting the weight of her words. "Not alone," he said quietly. For a long moment, Clara couldn't reply. Something knotted in her chest began to loosen. Just a little. As they moved again, the trees began to thin, and the soft glow of distant firelight flickered through the branches. It was the edge of the Shawnee village, a safe place to rest before the final leg to the trading post. Word had traveled ahead. When they entered the clearing, villagers emerged one by one. Willow Spirit, her silver hair glinting in the moonlight. Bright River, carrying a clay pot of stew, and the children, wide-eyed and whispering to one another. Grey Wolf and Stone Hand gently lowered the litter onto soft pine needles. Clara struggled to sit, wincing as pain shot through her leg. Willow's Spirit was there in an instant, pressing a calming hand to Clara's shoulder, murmuring words that soothed even without understanding. Bright River knelt beside her, ladling warm stew into a small bowl and offering it with a kind smile. Clara accepted it, grateful beyond words. The scent of herbs and smoked meat filled her senses, grounding her in the moment. Hawkeye's remained close, speaking softly with Grey Wolf and Red Feather as they exchanged watch rotations. His eyes flicked often to Clara and Grace, a quiet protector standing just at the edge of the circle. Later, as the village settled into sleep, Hawkeye's sat at the fire sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of stone on blade filling the night. Clara watched from where she lay, Grace tucked beside her, and felt something unfamiliar stir inside her, safety fragile and precious. In the flickering light, their eyes met, and for the first time, Clara smiled without fear. As dawn approached, Clara woke to the soft hush of Willow's Spirit's voice. The older woman gently checked her leg, applying a fresh wrap of poultices, though they could not share words. Willow's Spirit's hands spoke volumes. Patience, wisdom, care. Bright River entered with a small carved rattle and offered it shyly. Clara took it in wonder, shaking it gently beside Grace's ear. The baby's eyes fluttered open, a soft coo escaping her lips, and the gathered women chuckled quietly. For that moment, the forest, the storm, and the hunger of the past few weeks slipped away. Outside the lodge, Hawkeyes and Grey Wolf made plans for the road ahead. The trading post was a day's journey away, but danger still waited in the shadows. Malcolm's men might be close, and the settlers would not let a woman, especially one with land and a child, slip away easily. Inside, Clara drew in a steadying breath. She reached up and brushed her fingers along Grace's dark hair, marveling at the tiny miracle in her arms. As the sun rose beyond the trees, Hawkeyes stepped into the lodge, his expression gentle but firm. He touched his chest. "Soon," he said softly. Clara nodded. She was ready. The pale light of morning filtered through the tall pines, casting thin rays across the village. A quiet hum of activities stirred the camp, soft footsteps, the crackle of fire, the murmur of voices as women prepared food and men inspected weapons and tools. Clara sat on a blanket near the fire, cradling Grace close to her chest. The baby nuzzled against her, eyes half closed, a picture of peace that felt almost miraculous given all they had endured. Clara's leg throbbed dully under the poultice willow spirit had wrapped so carefully, but her mind was sharper today. She watched the people around her, their practiced movements, their quiet strength. She saw Bright River sorting herbs, Willow Spirit murmuring over the fire, Grey Wolf sharpening arrowheads nearby. These people, so foreign and feared by her kind, had shown her more kindness in days than she'd received from her own in months. And yet, time was slipping away. Hawkeyes approached, his long shadow falling across her blanket. His expression was calm, but his eyes were edged with something harder today, a quiet tension she hadn't seen before. He knelt beside her, motioning with his hands. "Today," he said softly, gesturing west. "We go." Clara felt her throat tighten. She looked down at Grace, brushing a trembling hand along the baby's cheek. "So soon," she whispered. Hawkeyes watched her closely. "You afraid?" he asked, his voice hesitant but thoughtful. Clara hesitated. "Yes," she said at last. "Afraid." He nodded, as if he understood more than the word alone. Then he touched his chest. "I, with you." The simple phrase sent an unexpected warmth through her. She glanced up, meeting his gaze, and for a moment the ache in her chest eased. A few paces away, Grey Wolf and Stone Hand prepared the litter once again, checking the bindings and straps. Red Feather slipped through the trees, scouting the path. Willow Spirit crouched near the fire, mixing something in a small leather pouch. Herbs for the baby, Clara guessed. Bright River approached with a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. She held it out shyly to Clara, unrolling it to reveal a finely stitched baby sling, its patterns of blue and white thread shimmering faintly in the morning light. Clara's breath caught. She ran her fingers over the fabric, touched beyond words. Bright River smiled and mimed, tying the sling around Clara's shoulders. Hawkeyes stepped forward to help, his fingers surprisingly gentle as they secured the knot behind her back. Once Grace was settled snug against her chest, Clara reached out and squeezed Bright River's hand, whispering, "Thank you." Bright River nodded, her eyes bright. The village gathered as the small group prepared to leave. Clara felt the weight of their gazes, some curious, some anxious, some resigned. She caught Willow Spirit's eye and was surprised when the older woman leaned in, pressing a small carved pendant into her palm, a tiny hawk in flight. "Protection," Willow Spirit murmured softly. "For you, for child." Clara clutched the pendant tightly, feeling the cool press of wood against her skin. Her eyes blurred with tears. By mid-morning, they set out. The path was rough, winding through dense thickets and over rocky slopes. Clara walked a few steps at a time, leaning on a carved walking stick. Bright River had given her, while Grey Wolf or Stone Hand supported her other side. Grace slept against her chest, warm and steady, a small miracle wrapped in rabbit fur. Hawkeyes moved ahead, scanning the trail with sharp eyes. Red Feather darted in and out of the trees like a flash of sunlight, scouting for danger. They covered ground carefully, always alert, always silent. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the sky a pale, cloudless blue overhead. Around midday they paused in a shaded hollow, the sound of a creek bubbling nearby. Hawkeyes crouched beside Clara, offering a strip of dried meat and a small water pouch. She accepted both gratefully, her hands trembling slightly as she ate. She met his gaze and whispered, "Why, help me." Hawkeye's was quiet for a moment, then spoke slowly. "Because life matters." He touched 2 fingers to his chest, then gestured to Grace, to Clara, to the trees around them. "Because we are all part." Clara felt something break open in her chest, something tender, raw, and painfully grateful. She reached out, her fingers brushing his briefly. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice shaking. He offered a small, quiet smile. As they prepared to move again, Red Feather returned, his face pale and urgent. He spoke quickly to Hawkeye's, his words clipped and sharp. Clara didn't understand the language, but the tension that rippled through the group was unmistakable. "Riders," Hawkeye's said, turning to her. "We must go fast." Her heart pounded. Malcolm, without another word, Grey Wolf and Stone Hand lifted the litter, and the group slipped into the trees, the forest swallowing them whole. The sun climbed higher as the small group slipped deeper into the forest. The air was cool under the trees, but Clara felt sweat trickle down her spine. Her leg throbbed with each step, and the weight of Grace in the sling pressed against her ribs. But she didn't complain. She didn't dare. She could sense the urgency in the air, see it in the tightness of Hawkeye's shoulders and the clipped way Red Feather spoke when he returned from scouting ahead. The word Clara didn't understand, but kept hearing over and over. Riders clung to her like a cold hand on the back of her neck. Malcolm, even in her exhaustion, her thoughts raced back to him, his sharp voice, his cold smiles, the way he'd whispered reassurances to the others on the wagon train, even as he pushed her aside. She had once thought him her protector. Now she knew better. He would hunt her not for love, not for family, but for what she carried: land papers, inheritance, the only thing left from David that Malcolm craved. She stumbled slightly, and Hawkeye's was there at her side in an instant, steadying her with a firm hand on her arm. "Slow," he murmured softly. "We go careful." Clara met his eyes, gratitude blooming in her chest, and nodded. They traveled in single file now, Hawkeye's leading, Grey Wolf behind Clara, with the litter folded and strapped to his back. Red Feather slipping like a ghost between the trees, and Stone Hand bringing up the rear. The forest around them changed as they went. The pines thinned, giving way to towering oaks, and the earth softened underfoot, damp and rich. Bird song flitted between the branches, but even the birds seemed hushed, as if they too sensed the tension. Around midday, they reached a narrow creek. Hawkeye's motioned for them to stop. He crouched at the water's edge, his hand trailing through the current, then turned back toward Clara. "Here," he said quietly, gesturing for her to sit on a mossy log. Clara sank down gratefully, shifting Grace in the sling, pressing a kiss to the baby's soft hair. She glanced around at the others. Grey Wolf, drinking deeply from the creek, Stone Hand chewing on a strip of jerky, Red Feather crouched high in a tree, watching the trail they had come from. For a moment, there was peace. Clara caught Hawkeye's watching her. She met his gaze, and without thinking, offered him a tired but genuine smile. "Your people," she began softly, struggling for the right words. "Kind to me." Hawkeye's tilted his head, understanding more from her tone than her words. "We care," he said simply, touching his chest. "All life." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. She reached into a pocket and pulled out the carved hawk pendant Willow's spirit had given her, running her thumb over its smooth edges. "Thank you," she whispered again, unsure if the words were enough, but needing to say them all the same. A moment of stillness was broken when Red Feather slipped from the tree, his face taut with alarm. He spoke quickly in Shawnee, the urgency unmistakable. Hawkeye's expression hardened. He turned to Clara, his voice low but sharp. "We must move. Now." Clara's heart lurched. She stood, clutching Grace close, and stumbled slightly, but Hawkeye's caught her before she could fall, his arm strong and steady. Without wasting another second, They plunged into the woods again, the creek behind them, the sound of their footsteps muffled in the leaf litter. The hours blurred as they wove through the underbrush, skirting narrow ravines and ducking beneath low-hanging branches. Clara's muscles burned, her lungs strained, but she forced herself to keep going to match the steady rhythm of the men around her. Suddenly they reached a steep, rocky slope. Hawk eyes turned, gesturing quickly. "We climb, safer." Clara stared at the jagged rocks, panic clawing at her chest. I can't." But Grey Wolf was there, dropping the litter to the ground and reaching for her arm. Between his steady grip and Hawkeye's sure footing, they guided her up the incline, step by step, until they reached the top. There, sprawled beneath them, was a broad valley, and in the distance, just visible in the fading light, the faint outline of the trading post. Smoke curled from chimneys, a promise of shelter at last. Clara let out a shaky breath, sagging against Grey Wolf, her eyes blurring with tears of exhaustion and relief. But the reprieve was short. Red Feather reappeared, breathless, pointing back along the ridge. His voice was a tense whisper, and the meaning was clear even without translation. They were being followed. Hawk eyes moved quickly, signaling the others. Grey Wolf took Clara's arm again, guiding her forward. Stone Hand unstrapped the litter, readying it for the final push. Red Feather slipped into the shadows to cover their trail. Clara's legs trembled as she moved, but she felt a spark of determination flare in her chest. Grace whimpered softly in the sling, and Clara bent her head to press a kiss to her daughter's forehead. "We're almost there," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "We're almost safe." As night fell over the valley, they descended into the dark, a band of unlikely companions bound together by survival, by courage, and by the fragile, fierce hope of a mother who refused to give up. Darkness fell over the valley like a heavy cloak, and the forest came alive with sounds. The rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of a wind through pine needles. But beneath all of it, Clara sensed the most dangerous sound of all, the faint, almost inaudible beat of pursuit. Hawkeye's moved swiftly at the front, his silhouette cutting through the trees like a shadow. Grey Wolf walked beside Clara, his arms steady around her waist as she stumbled over roots and rocks. Grace whimpered in her sling, stirring against Clara's chest, but Clara held her tightly, murmuring soft reassurances through cracked lips. Behind them, Stone Hand carried the folded litter, his broad shoulders tense. Red Feather ghosted ahead and behind, doubling back to check their trail, his lean form little more than a flicker among the trees. Every so often, he would return with a terse warning, a sharp glance, a whispered word in Shawnee, and each time Hawkeye's jaw would tighten just a little more. They descended the slope cautiously, moonlight silvering the rocks, the distant lights of the trading post glowing faintly in the valley below. Clara's heart pounded. She could almost taste safety, but the memory of Malcolm's face haunted her, the way his eyes hardened when he wanted something, the sharp edge of his smile when he got it. She remembered the push, the shock of cold air as she fell, the look on his face as the wagon rolled on without her. She stumbled, her leg buckling, and Grey Wolf caught her with a quiet grunt. "Slow," he murmured, the word unfamiliar but the meaning clear. Clara gasped, a shaky breath, blinking back tears. "I can keep going," she whispered, though her voice trembled. Hawkeye's turned briefly, his eyes softening. "Strong," he murmured with a small, fierce nod. Suddenly Red Feather appeared from the shadows, his face tense. He spoke quickly, pointing back along the ridge. Clara didn't understand the words, but the urgency in his voice hit her like a slap. "Men," Hawkeye said, glancing at her. "Close." Clara's breath hitched. She tightened her hold on Grace, feeling the baby squirm against her chest. "Please," she whispered, not sure if she was begging them or praying to the night itself. "Please let us make it." Without a word, Hawkeye's shifted course, cutting sharply to the left through a narrow ravine, choked with brambles. Stone Hand and Grey Wolf followed, without hesitation, guiding Clara through the thorns. Branches clawed at her dress, tore at her sleeves, but she hardly noticed. All that mattered was the warmth of Grace's small body, the steady grip of the men around her, and the faint flicker of firelight far ahead. They emerged onto a narrow trail just as the sounds of pursuit grew clearer. Voices, the snap of branches, the faint clatter of hooves on stone. "Go!" Hawkeyes commanded, urgency sharpening his voice. Clara's legs felt like water, but she forced herself forward, half-dragged by Grey Wolf, her breath rasping in her throat. Grace let out a thin, wailing cry, the sound slicing through the night. Clara clutched her closer. "Shh, sweetheart. Shh, please," she murmured, but her own voice cracked on the words. They reached the edge of the last slope, a steep, rocky descent toward the trading post's outer buildings. Clara saw the faint glow of lanterns, heard the distant bark of dogs, the muted clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Hope surged, raw and painful. But behind them, the voices drew nearer. Red Feather turned, slipping into the darkness like a wraith. Hawk Eyes called out to him sharply, but Red Feather only lifted a hand in brief farewell and vanished into the trees. Grey Wolf urged Clara forward, his strong hand at her back. Hawk Eyes moved beside her, his bow in hand, his eyes flicking between the trail and the shadows. Clara stumbled, caught herself, and kept moving. She thought of David, of the life they had dreamed of. She thought of the kindness of these strangers. She thought of Grace, the tiny heartbeat pressed against her own. She would not fall. Not now. At the base of the slope, the group paused under the cover of a rocky outcrop. Hawk Eyes scanned the trading post, his body taut with concentration. "Safe soon," he whispered to Clara, his hand brushing her arm. Clara let out a breath. She hadn't realized she was holding. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, pressing her lips to Grace's soft hair. Behind them, the forest stirred. Hawk Eyes turned sharply, his fingers tightening on his bowstring. For one endless heartbeat, Clara thought the end had come. Then Red Feather emerged from the trees, breathless but grinning. He spoke quickly, gesturing behind him. Whatever danger had been there was gone. At least for tonight. Hawk Eyes exhaled slowly. Lowering his bow, he turned to Clara, a rare, quiet smile curving his lips. "Soon. Home," he murmured. Clara closed her eyes, a shaky laugh bubbling in her chest. Against all odds, they were still standing. The night was deep and still as the group emerged from the tree line, the last stretch of forest falling away behind them. Clara nearly collapsed onto the rough ground as Grey Wolf and Stone Hand eased her down beside a patch of tall grass. The trading post flickered just ahead, its lanterns throwing golden halos into the dark, the soft murmur of voices carrying on the night breeze. Clara cradled Grace tightly, tears blurring her vision as she stared at the wooden walls and thatched roofs of the small settlement. Smoke drifted from chimneys, dogs barked at the edge of the corrals, and a tired mule brayed from within a paddock. It wasn't beautiful, and it wasn't home, but to Clara it was salvation. Hawk Eyes crouched beside her, one hand brushing her arm, his sharp gaze sweeping the buildings below. "We go." "Careful," he murmured. Clara nodded weakly. "Please?" "Yes." They moved as one down the slope. Hawk Eyes in front, Clara and Grey Wolf in the center, Stone Hand at their back. Red Feather circled wide to check the perimeter, his form blending with the shadows like mist. As they neared the outer gate, a low voice called out sharply. Hawk Eyes raised one hand in peace, his fingers spread wide and waited. A moment later, a tall man stepped forward from the shadows of the gate. His clothes were patched and travel-worn, his weathered face framed by a graying beard. Beside him stood a woman, dark-haired, wrapped in a shawl, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Caleb McAllister," Hawk Eyes said, dipping his head slightly. The man's brow furrowed, but his voice was calm. "Hawk Eyes, I didn't expect you tonight." Clara felt herself sway, exhaustion pulling at her like a tide. The woman at Caleb's side stepped forward quickly, her expression softening as her gaze fell on Clara and the baby. "She needs rest," the woman murmured. "Bring her in." Inside the post's main house, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and baking bread. Clara was led to a cot near the hearth, the warmth soaking into her chilled skin. The woman introduced herself quietly as Naomi, her voice calm and sure as she helped untangle the baby's sling from Clara's shoulders. Grace stirred, letting out a soft cry, and Naomi smiled gently, brushing a finger over the baby's cheek. "She's strong," she murmured, "like her mother." Clara let out a shaky breath. Her head fell back against the pillow, and for the first time in what felt like forever, her body sagged into something soft, something safe. At the heavy wooden table, Caleb and Hawkeyes spoke in low tones. Caleb's face was lined with concern, his grey eyes flicking toward Clara more than once as he listened. "You're sure it was Malcolm?" Caleb asked, voice tight. Hawkeyes gave a short nod. "He follows, not far." Caleb rubbed a hand over his face. "I will need to keep watch tonight." He stood and crossed to Clara, his expression softening. "You're safe here, ma'am. We'll see you through." Clara's throat tightened, but she forced the words out. "Thank you." Later that night, as the post quieted and the hearth fire burned low, Hawkeyes knelt beside Clara's cot. His shadow stretched across the floor, long and lean, flickering in the firelight. Clara stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Hawkeyes." He gave her a small, rare smile. "Rest now." Clara reached for his hand without thinking, her fingers brushing his calloused palm. "Stay?" For a moment Hawkeyes hesitated. Then he shifted to sit near the hearth, his figure a quiet sentinel as the night deepened. Clara's eyes drifted closed. The last thing she saw, the faint curve of his smile and the soft glow of firelight on his face. Outside, Grey Wolf and Stone Hand kept watch near the gates, their figures still and alert in the moonlight. Red Feather lingered at the edge of the forest, his sharp eyes fixed on the dark line of trees. And in the hush of the trading post, Clara slept at last, her baby warm in her arms, the first threads of safety beginning to weave around them like a fragile new home. The sun rose slowly over the trading post, casting its golden glow on the weathered rooftops and smoke-threaded sky. Morning light streamed through the small window near Clara's cot, warming her face and stirring her awake. For the first time in days, she felt something close to peace, though it was fragile like a glass about to crack. Grace stirred against her chest, her tiny fists balling near her chin, a soft sigh escaping her lips. Clara smiled faintly, brushing a kiss to the baby's forehead, but as the haze of sleep lifted, the sharp edge of reality returned. She was not safe. Not yet. Naomi entered quietly. A small wooden tray balanced in her hands, fresh bread, a cup of broth, a handful of berries. "Eat, child," Naomi murmured, her voice gentle. "You need your strength." Clara accepted the food with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, her throat still raw. She glanced toward the window where Hawkeyes stood outside, speaking softly with Caleb and Grey Wolf. Naomi followed her gaze and smiled knowingly. "He's been watching over you all night." Clara swallowed, her heart tightening. She hadn't known men like Hawkeyes existed, men who protected without expectation, who helped without question. She felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest, a mixture of gratitude, sorrow, and something almost like longing. Outside, Caleb's face was lined with concern as he rubbed his chin, eyes flicking between Hawkeyes and the road beyond the post. "Malcolm's been here," Caleb muttered, "asking questions, flashing money." He shook his head. "He won't let this rest." Hawkeyes crossed his arms, his expression carved from stone. "We take her father." Caleb looked up sharply. "You'd risk that?" The Shawnee warrior gave a short nod. "Yes." Inside, Clara watched as Naomi gently rocked Grace in her arms, cooing softly to the child. The sight filled Clara's heart with bittersweet warmth. This brief, tender moment amid so much turmoil. When Hawkeyes stepped through the door, she sat up slowly. her eyes locking on his. "You're taking us away?" she asked hesitantly, her voice still thick from sleep. He moved closer, crouching beside the cot. "Fort Haven," he said, his voice calm and certain. "Safe. Soldiers there." Clara's chest tightened. A part of her wanted to collapse in relief, but another part, stubborn and terrified, whispered, "What if he doesn't come with us? What if I lose him too?" She reached out, her fingers brushing his wrist lightly. "You'll stay?" she whispered. For a long moment, Hawkeye's was silent, his dark eyes steady on hers. Then, with the faintest curve of his lips, he placed his hand over hers. "I stay until safe." Later, as the sun climbed higher, Caleb gathered supplies: food, water, blankets, a battered map. Naomi packed a small bundle of herbs and medicines, pressing it into Clara's hands with a soft blessing. Outside, Grey Wolf and Stone Hand prepared the horses, their faces quiet and focused. Red Feather slipped along the perimeter one last time, eyes sharp, movements swift as ever. Clara watched it all unfold with a heavy heart. She knew she owed these people her life. She knew she owed Hawkeyes more than words could say. As the party prepared to leave, Naomi embraced Clara tightly. "You're stronger than you think," she whispered. "And you have friends now." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. "I'll never forget you," Naomi smiled, brushing a lock of hair from Clara's face. "Just live. That's thanks enough." At the gates, Hawkeyes lifted Clara onto one of the horses with practiced ease, his hands lingering briefly at her waist. Grace nestled against her chest, wrapped tightly in the blue and white sling Bright River had made. Caleb offered a firm handshake to Hawkeyes. "You're a good man," he murmured. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Hawkeyes inclined his head slightly, then turned to Clara, his gaze softening. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Clara looked down at Grace, at the road ahead, then back at Hawkeyes. "I'm ready," she whispered. As they rode from the trading post, the wind tugged at her hair. The road stretched wide before them, and for the first time, Clara dared to believe that a new beginning, however uncertain, was waiting just over the horizon. The road stretched before them in a ribbon of packed earth, winding between the dense trees and over shallow streams that glimmered under the morning sun. Clara sat astride the horse, her arms wrapped protectively around Grace, whose soft breaths warmed her chest. Every step of the journey jostled her sore muscles, but Clara barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on Hawkeyes, riding just ahead, his dark figure a steady presence, his long black hair rippling in the breeze. Behind them, Grey Wolf and Stone Hand rode in calm silence, their sharp eyes scanning the woods for danger. Red Feather slipped in and out of the trees, appearing briefly on the trail before vanishing like a wraith into the underbrush. The further they rode, the more the tension in Clara's chest began to ease. Each mile between her and Balcom felt like a weight lifting from her shoulders, but along with the relief came something unexpected, a bittersweet ache, a quiet grief for the people and the place she had to leave behind. By midday they stopped near a wide meadow, the grass rippling in waves of green and gold. Hawkeyes dismounted first, helping Clara carefully down from the horse. His hands were warm and sure at her waist, and for a heartbeat too long, neither of them moved. Clara felt the air shift between them. She looked up into his dark eyes, her throat tightening. "Fort Haven," Hawkeyes murmured, pointing westward. "Soon," Clara nodded slowly, her gaze flicking from the horizon back to his face. She wanted to speak, to ask him the question that had haunted her since they left the trading post. "What happens when we get there? Will you stay? Will you disappear into the trees as if none of this ever happened?" But the words tangled on her tongue. As they rested, Grey Wolf passed around strips of dried meat and a small flask of water. Red Feather crouched by a fallen log, sharpening his knife with quick, precise strokes. Stone Hand tended the horses, his broad hands moving with patient care. Clara sat on the grass, Grace cradled in her lap, the baby's tiny fists waving sleepily in the warm breeze. Hawk eyes settled beside her, close but not touching, his quiet presence grounding her. For a time they simply sat together, watching the wind dance through the meadow. Later, as the sun dipped lower, Clara turned to Hawkeye's, her voice hesitant. "When we reach Fort Haven, what will you do?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. Then he spoke softly. "My path is here." Clara's heart gave a painful twist. She nodded, blinking hard, her fingers tightening on Grace. She had known, of course she had known, but hearing it still felt like a blade drawn through her chest. She drew a shaky breath. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. "For everything." Hawkeye's turned to her, his eyes warm and steady. "You are strong," he said quietly. "You will make a good life." Clara let out a small, choked laugh. "I don't feel strong." He reached out then, gently brushing a lock of hair from her cheek. "You are," he murmured. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. That night, they camped at the edge of the forest, a small fire crackling between them. Grey Wolf told quiet stories in Shawnee, his voice low and soothing. Stone Hand mended a broken strap, his broad fingers deft and sure. Red Feather sang softly to himself as he polished his bow. Clara lay wrapped in a blanket. Grace nestled against her, watching the flicker of firelight dance across Hawkeye's face. She wanted to memorize every detail, the sharp line of his jaw, the thoughtful crease of his brow, the rare, quiet smile that sometimes softened his features. In the hush of the night, she whispered a promise to herself that she would carry this memory, this moment, with her wherever she went. As the stars wheeled overhead, Clara closed her eyes and let the sound of the fire, the murmured voices, and the steady beat of her daughter's heart lull her to sleep. She didn't know what waited beyond Fort Haven. She didn't know what shape her life would take. But she knew this. She had survived, and she had been changed, not just by hardship, but by grace, by kindness, by a man she never expected to meet on the road between loss and hope. The early morning mist hung low over the hills, softening the shapes of trees and rocks as the final leg of their journey unfolded. Clara rode in silence, her arms wrapped around Grace, who snuffled softly against her chest. The blue and white sling was smudged with dirt and sweat, but it cradled her baby like a shield, a small cocoon of warmth and life. Ahead, the silhouette of Fort Haven emerged from the haze, sturdy wooden walls, a watchtower rising above the treetops, the distant clatter of hooves and voices carrying across the meadow. A knot of emotions tangled in Clara's chest. Relief, dread, and the sharp sting of farewell. Hawkeye's slowed his horse beside hers, his dark eyes sweeping the horizon. He said nothing, but Clara could feel the quiet tension in his frame, the weight of a decision neither of them wanted to name. At the fort gates, soldiers moved to intercept, rifles slung over shoulders, eyes wary. But when they saw the group approaching, Clara bedraggled but upright, cradling a baby Hawkeye's and his men riding at a protective distance, their postures softened. One officer stepped forward, frowning slightly. "Ma'am, you're from the westward train, aren't you?" His eyes flicked to Grace, then to Hawkeye's. "We heard about the trouble on the ridge." Clara nodded slowly. "Yes, I'm Clara Whitmore." She hesitated, then drew a shaky breath. "And this is Grace." The officer's gaze softened. "You're safe now, ma'am. We'll see you settled inside." As the gates creaked open, Clara turned in the saddle, her heart lurching. Hawkeye's was already pulling his horse back, his face calm but distant. Grey Wolf, Stone Hand, and Red Feather waited nearby, their expressions steady, their hands resting lightly on reins. Clara felt her throat tighten. Sliding carefully from the horse, she approached Hawkeye's, cradling Grace close. Her voice faltered. "I don't know how to thank you." Hawkeye's held her gaze, his eyes deep and still. Then he raised his hand slowly, fingers brushing over Grace's soft hair, lingering for just a moment. "Strong mother," he said softly. "Strong child." Clara's eyes blurred with tears. Will I see you again? For a heartbeat, the question hung between them, heavy and fragile. Hawkeye's gave a small, quiet smile. The world is wide. It was no promise, and yet it was everything. As Hawkeye's turned his horse, Clara reached for his hand on impulse, catching his fingers briefly in hers. No words passed between them. Only a look, a moment, a silent acknowledgement of all they had endured together. She watched as the group rode away, their figures shrinking into the mist, their shapes fading between trees like spirits of the forest. Inside the fort, time moved quickly. A cot was prepared for Clara, clean clothes offered, a bath drawn. Doctors checked her leg, smiling at her good fortune. Neighbors murmured in sympathy, strangers offered congratulations, and soldiers spoke of a land office that would secure her inheritance. But through it all, Clara's mind drifted to the faces she had left behind. The quiet strength of Hawkeye's, the fierce loyalty of Grey Wolf and Stone Hand, the quicksilver grin of Red Feather, the gentle wisdom of Willow's Spirit and Bright River. They were gone from sight, but not from her. One evening, weeks later, Clara stood at the edge of the fort, Grace bundled in her arms. The wind tugged at her shawl as she looked toward the dark line of trees at the horizon. She raised her hand, brushing the carved hawk pendant at her throat, its shape worn smooth by her fingers. As she watched the stars bloom one by one in the darkening sky, Clara whispered a quiet promise. We'll carry you with us. Always. Years would pass. Grace would grow strong and wild, her dark eyes full of fire, her laughter ringing through the fields, and when Clara told her daughter the story of how they survived, she would speak not of the betrayal that nearly ended them, but of the hands that saved them, of the people who crossed worlds to deliver them to safety. She would speak of Hawkeye's, and her daughter would carry that name forward, a bridge between two worlds, a reminder that sometimes the people who change our lives the most are the ones we least expect.